We'll leave some time for Q&A. If you have any questions along the way, feel free to put them into the Q&A panel, and I'll be the facilitator to pick those questions that make sense to be picked up along the way. Otherwise, we'll take questions at the end of the session. With that, over to you, Gary.
Thank you, Hemant. Welcome, everyone. I want to open by wishing everyone a Merry Christmas and a very happy holidays, and thank you for the time you're spending with us today. So let's get right into it. We're going to talk about breaking down the Epic user story, and of course we have to begin that with something funny. I can hear everyone laughing. So these are the questions that I wish for us to kind of cover today, and this is by way of agenda. I do want to return just briefly to a small discussion on why epics are important to us. Then I'd like to get into, well, when do we break them down and who breaks them down, and then finally to the meat of the matter, what are some guidelines and how do we actually do it. So let's start with why our epics remain important to us. So this very busy slide that some of you may have seen before is a depiction of Scrum, the Scrum methodology on a page. And we won't spend a lot of time on this one, but there are a couple of pieces to this that puts it all into context for us. Specifically the product backlog at the bottom left of the screen, and the results that we get when we appropriately, with discipline, apply our process. So that product backlog, the velocity, and some of the measurements and forecasting that we can do is really the context for why we want to talk about epics as still being important to us. So let's delve into the product backlog itself. So our product backlog is our essential planning tool in this approach. It's that list of features and goals and items that your product needs to provide in order to meet a business need. If you're following Scrum, then you're familiar with the concept of the product owner, that particular role. The product owner is accountable for creating and maintaining this list and grooming it over time. And it is this list that drives all of the work for all of our sprints. So in our process of sprint planning, we will be referring to this list to derive what work we're going to do. Now there are a lot of different ways to populate this list of things, this product backlog, but user stories are some of the most popular today. And one of the things that's very nice about user stories is that they can, they're quite easy to create and understand. So here's one that I've tagged in at the bottom that we're going to return to. As a theater patron, I can reserve a seat online so that I am sure I can go to the play. So we'll be talking about that one quite a bit. We have a nice list of things as well that help us to write good user stories, whether they are epic or otherwise. This list we get from a fine gentleman named Bill Wake from the extreme programming side of the house. If you've had an opportunity to study some of these things, this is something that's not new to you, but let me pause for just a moment and walk through these very quickly for those of you who may be new to the topic. This is the INVEST model that characterizes good stories. It starts with independent, simply meaning that the product backlog items, user stories themselves, are written in such a way that they're as least coupled to one another, least dependent upon each other as possible. That characteristic aids our product owners in being able to finally prioritize them. Negotiable refers to that these are not little mini contracts or specifications that the team can negotiate with the product owner on how to satisfy the requirements that are represented by that story. Valuable, well, that seems kind of self-evident, but I suspect there are others like myself out there that have worked on projects and you wondered, is this really valuable, this work that I'm doing? So certainly a good story should be something that is of value to our product owner in our business. And ideally, they are able to actually put some measurements on those values. Estimable is simply an indication that what we are representing by the story is understandable enough and that the organization of the team has enough experience and wherewithal to place an estimate on the story. Small is why we're here and why we're talking today. So I'm going to skip over small and come back to it and end up with testable as the last word in our invest model. Testable simply indicates that the good user story has criteria around it. We understand it enough that we can actually confirm that we have satisfied it. So that's our invest model, and it's quite handy. Now the epic story, as it meets our criteria, is often not independent, and by definition it's not small. So in this little list of blocks that I have here, we're representing those larger epic stories as the big blocks down at the bottom. So even though these stories may not directly satisfy these two areas of the invest model, they are very, very key to knowing something, specifically how much is there. So as we gather a list of things to do, and as we are preparing them to drive our sprints, we would like to put some estimations on these things. Now this formula that's there is our fundamental planning formula. It's the theorem number one, if you will, in agile planning and estimation. And the numerator in this factor is the total features in the product backlog. So in my little example we have on screen here, you can see that those lime-colored blocks at the top that are good stories are usually pretty small. As we go deeper into the product backlog, indicating that these things are important to us, but they're not the priority of the day or the next sprint or couple of sprints, then the sizes get bigger and bigger. So this is one of the key advantages of keeping epics in your tool belt, because those big blocks that are in the 20s and 30s and 40s range is allowing the product owner and the product owner group to manage a lot of information in a very compact form. So we are able to represent this work that's important to the overall product development without having to pay the price of breaking them all down into those little chiclet size ones up at the top. Now this 180, this total number of features, allows us to fill out the rest of this equation, and it leads to our ability to produce this next artifact, which is our release burn-up. So that 180 in my little example here sets the target amount of work that we need to do in this particular product development cycle, and is really our destination, our means of measuring where do I stand against the total amount of work that has either been funded or is on our plate. So when we can produce a document, a artifact of this way, then we have the means to answer these important questions. How long is it going to take? When am I going to get my stuff? How much is it going to cost? How much can I do in a particular sprint? All of the answers to all of those questions has a dependency on our ability to build a product backlog and size a product backlog. And the Epic Story participates in that endeavor by allowing our product owners and their support staff to manage large groups of information very economically. So why are the epics important? Well, with epics, I can forecast. But probably even more important, as long as I have epics in my mix, I can get started sooner. So let me pause here and make sure that connection's made. One of the reasons that Agile approaches are becoming so popular today is that we are experienced in non-Agile processes where our ability to get our teams started on meaningful things is delayed by quite a bit of upfront analysis and design around requirements. So traditional methods have required us to build pretty thick speculative documents of pretty high precision in order to even get an idea of, is this a good project or not? And all of that time that is being spent, our teams are not working on those valuable things. So Agile principles wish to decouple some of that and concentrate on those things that are most important to our customer, but not forget that there are other bigger things underway. That's where the Epic really helps us get started sooner. We can very precisely define and analyze those features that are at the top of my product backlog list, break them down very small, and still be able to manage the information that's coming later in epics, but not have to break those down to get started. So my pithy sort of answer for why are epics still important to us, they are key for me to being able to forecast, and they are now enable me to get started sooner. So you might ask, well, if they're so great, why break them down at all, Gary? Well, I think that's a good question. So if we go back to our invest model, I said that small is one of the reasons that we wanted to talk. So let's return to small. The definition, the accepted definition of small in most of today's practitioners is a small story can be completely satisfied in a single sprint. So let's look at our example for a second. In this case, I'm indicating that I have that story that I teased you with earlier. As a theater patron, I can reserve a seat online so that I'm sure I can go to the play. And figuratively, I'm assuming that it's somewhere sort of in the middle of things. Well, I would imagine that if you think for a second, even if you're not in the theater patron business or the theater management business, reserving a seat online is a fairly sizable piece of work. Since our sprint lengths are pretty small, somewhere between 1 to 4 weeks, it's entirely possible that a team could not satisfy everything they needed to do in order to satisfy the story as it's written. So what we want to do is take this guy and break him down into smaller stories. So, for example, as a theater patron, I can choose a seat from a seat map so that I can sit where I want, together with, as a theater patron, I can pay for my chosen seat so that I can complete my reservation. So there's just one example of how we could have taken a pretty epic-sized story and broken it down into smaller bite-sized pieces that fit nicely into a single sprint. And so that's the reason that we want to break down these very valuable epics, is because when they get to the top of the list, this small indicator becomes very important to our teams, and we would like to be able to bite off those pieces that we can address ourselves to and complete to a high degree of quality and completeness. Potentially shippable is the term we so often use. So in today's session, now that I've got all the background, if I've convinced you that epics are good, but that we need to break those guys down, then we'll get into the, well, all right, Gary, fine and dandy, tell me how to do that. So I'm going to tease you a little bit more and say, let's start by talking about when we actually do it, because that's pretty important as well. So you have a couple of choices when you want to break down your epics. I'm going to start with this kind of busy timeline. Let me describe it to you real quick. Up in the left-hand side, we see the initial product backlog work. And think of these blocks as just representing some time, sort of the old style Gantt chart kind of timelines and things. So with any endeavor, you're going to have to invest up front some time to get that initial product backlog going. And you want to do enough of him to get that first sprint planning meeting underway and get that first sprint execution underway. So that's what that second tier of lines are. Now concurrently with all of that work, your product backlog grooming is going to continue. So this indicates that all that hard work that the product owner and the product owner support group are doing to continue to build that product backlog, to continue to populate it, do the things necessary so that when the next sprint planning meeting is available, they have a list of things for the team to consider so they can make the commitment and go. So this first option is to do the grooming session, which would perforate or be between your sprints themselves. So the idea is that between the sprint 1 or sprint 2 or sprint 50 and 51, you set aside some time and you do some breakdown of your epic stories, and in that same session you go ahead and size those things. This could be just in time sort of breaking down and sizing, and you're waiting till the last responsible moment to do this, and these are actually candidates for your next sprint planning meeting. But what we advise at Synerzip and Improving is that the product ownership group be a little bit ahead, maybe 1 or 2 sprints ahead. That's something each company can dial in and decide for themselves. But what we want to avoid is getting into a sprint planning session and this product backlog grooming has not occurred, meaning we have not broken down those big epics, we have not sized them, et cetera, et cetera. So there's option number 1, and this option works in many organizations. I will say it's not my favorite. I like the second option better. In the second option, I'm actually doing this breaking down and the sizing as I go. So the timelines are very similar, but I don't separate my sprint executions and plannings with a grooming session. I determine how can I get ahead and stay ahead of my team and do just enough breaking down and sizing as I go so that when the next planning session is imminent, that I'm ready to go. Now this is the more difficult approach, no doubt, but the big advantage to this is number 1, it forces the product owner and the product owner group to not get too ambitious with the sizing sessions. So we have to take the breakdown of epics and the sizing in smaller pieces, because if you take too much time away from the team while they're in sprint trim, while they're actually in a sprint and executing, then that could delay them and could actually cause them to miss their sprint commitment and not deliver. So you have to find a meaningful but small period of time, and maybe you have to have multiple periods of time during a sprint to steal away from the team a little bit of their effort and present them some epics to break down and specifically size. So this is my favorite approach. One of the biggest advantages, in addition to requiring the product owners to be a little more conservative about how many of these they do at once, is this won't break your team's cadence. In my experience, once teams really get their feet under them and they're well into execution, there is a cadence, a rhythm that's there. And perforating that with even just a 2 or 3 day cycle of a sprint plan or a product backlog grooming session can kind of break that. So my teams have always said, I'd rather pay as I go, especially if the product owner will buy me lunch. So those are the 2 options from a timing standpoint. So that's when we do it. Let's talk about who does it. So in this picture, I have over to the right an illustration of all the stakeholders that and participants in a typical Scrum implementation. So there's almost always a sponsor represented as the green jersey in my little picture, and there's some multiple numbers of stakeholders that are out there. At the core of everything, we have our superstars, the team themselves. So we've got QA and BA and developers and tech writers and configuration managers and all the other specialists represented by the different colored jerseys in my picture that are part of the development team themselves. And then associated with but not having full membership in the team, we have our product owner and Scrum Master. And this is the typical arrangement that allows us to create a box of software, and away we go. So of all of these folks that are participating, well, who's actually responsible for breaking down the epics? Well, if you permit me to do an equivalence, everyone is. Everyone in this picture has some responsibilities to be able to assist the product owner in breaking down the epics. You know, even the sponsor, in many cases, some of my larger customers that have been exceedingly successful with this. Special shout out to my friends up in Oklahoma City in that regard. Their sponsorship will give broad guidelines, broad guidance, broad constraints on what they need to accomplish from a business standpoint. And that's very, very important information for the product owners to be able to discern not only how to build their product backlog, but how to break it down and size it. Of course, the stakeholders, they are often where the actual requirements are residing either in their heads, in their manuals, in their process. That's the real field of detailed requirements that we're operating in anyway. So they can certainly help us with acceptance criteria and wisely breaking down our epics in such ways that they are most valuable to themselves. The Scrum Master, as the facilitator that teaches, has responsibility to make sure that the team isn't knocked off their wheels, as it were, with planning sessions. And of course, the product owner has responsibility. The team themselves. Not only in just the sizing, we absolutely want the team that does the work to size the work, but so often we see that the development staff has very good input on what makes a meaningful breakdown of a story, even if we're keeping it at a business level. So everyone that's involved in a healthy application of agile principles like Scrum has some responsibility. But let's talk about accountability. Well, that's a little different subject. So with respect to who all is accountable, it gets pretty lonesome. At the end of the day, the product owner is accountable for breaking down the epics. It's their list. They are the single voice that drives development. When the team needs a decision made, when the team needs to know what its options are, when the team needs to negotiate if something goes awry, the principal party that they are negotiating with is the product owner. So even though we want to not isolate the product owner in this hard work, at the end of the day, the person that's carrying the A for accountable on their chest is the product owner. Alrighty, so now we've talked about why they're important, when we can do it, who gets to do it. Let's really get into the meat of the matter. How do we get this done? So I want to introduce 8 guidelines, 8 different approaches for breaking epics down into smalls. I originally found a list similar to this. This list is derived from what I found out there in the community. Humanizing Work LLC back in 2009 published the thing. I want to give them credit and a shout out to them. And as just sort of a personal statement, one of the reasons I'm still enjoying the business is that now I feel like I'm part of a community where I don't have to have all the answers. I can contribute back to it. The community is open. There are other bright guys and gals out there that are thinking about these issues, and they're making their ideas and answers available for the rest of us, and it just makes it a whole lot easier for those of us who are practitioners to know that we have those folks available to us and they have our back. And our responsibility is to try to support that community with things like this webinar that we're doing today. But this list is a great list, and I'm going to walk through every one of these, and I'm going to try to give you some examples that I've been able to discern, starting with workflow steps. So for the next few here, I'm going to go back to my candidate user story. I'm going to slow down a little bit. And on the left is the epic, and on the right are my candidate breakdowns. So workflow steps is the one that you'll probably end up using more often than not. It's the most evident one, and I suspect you practitioners out there have noticed that when you're talking with business folks and you start to get into the day in their life or their process, it becomes an easier conversation. It's easier for them to imagine what you're working on and what you're about to deliver when it has some similarity or congruence to the workflow that they do every day. So in our little case, you might think, well, what are some of the steps, workflow steps, in reserving a seat online? Well, I've given you 2 of them earlier. As a theater patron, I can choose from a seat map so that I can sit where I want, followed by I can pay for my chosen seat. So these are just 2. You can probably imagine some more, but I arrived at these 2 by thinking, well, what is the little workflow that a theater patron would be doing online to actually acquire a seat? You're probably thinking, well, I could put a login piece ahead of this. I could put a print ticket behind this. You start to get the feeling for how you can break epics down by just following the logical workflow that it is party to. That's number one, and probably a really useful one for you to denote and think about. Let's go to the second one, business rules. This one, most businesses have some rules that you need to follow. This one is maybe not quite as evident, but let's say that for the purposes of our discussion today, my theater company had this business rule that will allow someone to reserve a seat for a play that is active, one that we are actually about to do. But we're not going to try to reserve specific seats for our upcoming series of plays. So maybe that was a business rule. Well, we could break this reserve a seat online story down along those business rule lines. As a theater patron, I can reserve a specific seat for an active play so that I can go to the play. Followed by, as a theater patron, I can reserve a general admission seat for an upcoming play so that I'm sure I can get a ticket. So in this case, I'm simply using the business rules given me by the stakeholders and the product owner, and I'm breaking this larger story down along those lines. So that's a useful one as well. Number three, major effort. So many cases when we're struggling with these epic stories, we hear questions like, well, do I assume that this was done? Can I assume that that was done? Well, wow, we've got a lot of work we have to do just to get started in the tiniest bit of that. So depending on the maturity of your development efforts or the nature of your systems, you may have the ability to break down one of these stories into the big buckets of major effort, allowing one of them to carry a lot of that upfront sort of work and that infrastructural building sort of things, and yet carving out a piece that says, I'm going to build upon that major work. So in my little example here, I imagined that I could pull out quite a bit of work, put on quite a bit of design and infrastructure and testing. If I just satisfied as a theater patron, I can reserve a general admission seat so that I can go to the play. And then I could follow that up and build upon those designs, let that design and architecture emerge into I can reserve a specific seat so that I can sit where I want. So this is just one example of being able to take what is sort of two sides of the same coin, if you will, and allowing the major effort to be isolated and carried by one story, and the smaller pieces that build upon that to be a set of stories that's related to it. So this one's pretty handy as well. It's number 3 of 8. Now, somewhat related to this, but not necessarily along the lines of effort or size, there's the idea of considering the simple and complex. So I'm going to stay with my theater patrons reserve a seat online story, but now I'm going to see how could I break it down into simple and complex types of stories. So my offering in that regard is, as a theater patron, I can reserve a seat for myself so that I can go to the play, countered by, as a theater patron, I can reserve a seat for someone else so that they can go to the play. So I have a simpler scenario that, again, may allow me to get a lot of the basics in place, a lot of the data modeling and the test harnesses, and help my relationships with my customers build, and start with the simpler case of the ticket that I'm buying is for me, and then add on to that now the reserving a seat for someone else. But this one differs from the first one in so much as the effort, the large effort, the major effort may be carried by this second story in this regard. But I'm breaking it along simple and complex lines so that I can get the benefit of having a small story I can get into a single sprint. So simple and complex is often an overlooked one. I will confess that I often don't think about this option as I'm breaking stories down, but I think it is a very powerful option for you. The next one is a little, it takes a little while to kind of think about. It's called variations in data. I'm going to switch the story that I'm considering in this one. So instead of reserving a seat, I'm going to go to the story that is, as a theater patron, I can pay for my chosen seat so that I can complete my reservation. So variations in data, an example of that, are currencies. So currencies, languages, those things where this format of the data is the same, or the features themselves may manifest the same, but the underlying data may differ quite a bit, and it has some requirements that are special to them. So in this case, I've said I could break that one down by saying, well, as a theater patron, I can pay for my seat in US dollars so that I can complete my reservation. Followed by or supported by, as a theater patron, I can pay for my seat in euros so that I can complete my reservation. This one allows me to just take the difference in currencies and somewhat isolate them away, allowing my team to get started on all of the pieces I need to get a payment process in place without currency conversions and without some of those other complications, and allow me to let that variation of the data drive another story that lets me augment my system. So variations in data, I don't see this one as often, frankly, in practice. Now, maybe we have some folks that are from overseas, and y'all see this a whole lot more often than we do. There are some situations where it's not necessarily a US dollar versus euro thing. It could be state regulations that are different from one state to the next that you have to satisfy. Formats are different, et cetera, et cetera. So variations in data is one I would have you put on your list as you're searching for ways to break your epic stories down. Deferring non-functional. So non-functional requirements, let's recall that those are the virtues of a system, the qualities of a system. These are the illities, some folks will call them. So the maintainability, the performance, the user friendliness, those are qualities of a system. Often they are the most difficult requirements to satisfy at all. One approach that we can have to breaking an epic story down is to defer some of those non-functionals to a later story. Now let me be somewhat careful with this one. For the folks out there saying, well, how can I be potentially shippable and still defer these very important requirements like security and so forth? Remember, potentially shippable is a statement of quality, not content. So when we break these stories down smaller, should we choose to take the non-functionals and sequester them a little bit? It may mean that the feature that we're about to satisfy is not sufficiently complete to go all the way to production, but what it does mean that what we have chosen to program is completely done. There is zero work left on that piece of it. It is the product owner's call to discern, do I have enough of the requirements satisfied to make a production release that will actually withstand this production, that production environment. So we don't mean to indicate by this one that you can defer those very important non-functional requirements and automatically assume that you can go into production with that story, because potentially shippable is really a statement of quality, not content. So with that little aside, here's my idea of how we could take our pay for my chosen seat story and defer some non-functionals. As a theater patron, I can supply payment info to pay for my seat so that I can complete my reservation. Coupled with, as a theater patron, I can add payment information to my profile so that I can use it when I pay for seats. So the non-functional I'm deferring here is one of security, one of data integrity and non-repudiation and all those other security sort of things. In the first story, I'm indicating that we're just going to ask for credit card information as we are doing the transaction, and then it's going to be thrown away once we have our payment ID or whatever it may be. So we are not having to store and encrypt and protect any information because it's only transient for long enough time to get it securely, put it in a secure transaction, and it's gone. The second story is a story of convenience and a story of security. So now we have we're bringing online the concept of a profile for my theater patron, so they can give me payment information, and then all of those other security issues now come to bear, so that I don't keep everything in clear text, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the best one I could come up with to be able to still do all the valuable work for being able to pay for the reservation, but defer a non-functional to maybe the next sprint or two. Number 7, CRUD. So for folks that have perhaps been in the industry as long as I have, you'll remember CRUD, the create, read, update, delete metaphor or acronym. So operations, these simply refer to those basic operations that we are having to satisfy. So I'm switching stories on us again. Now I'm moving into a story that's got a different role. As a producer, I can manage my shows so that I can sell tickets to them. So in the big product backlog for my theater management system, this is an important story. In fact, it may be a story that's done well in advance of the theater patron story that we've talked about. And I see the word manage. In fact, I like the word manage a lot because in this one story, I can bundle together those creating and those updating and those deleting stories because those are all operations to help me manage the things. So it becomes a fairly simple breakdown, y'all, to say I can take a manage my show story and break it into I can create a new show so that I can set ticket prices. I can update information about a show so that the website is accurate. You can see what would be next after this. So this one is very utilitarian and it's a really easy one for you to have in your tool belt to break down those large stories. Now one caution, as you're building product backlogs, gang, often you'll, in this particular area, you'll start with the smaller stories. You'll actually see stories represent creating and updating and deleting. Remember that it works both ways. You can bundle those smaller stories, especially if they are part of a part of the system that's coming later. Bundle them together and call them an epic for now. Let that epic carry those smaller stories and size it appropriately. That epic then is working for you to manage large pieces of information very economically. And our last one that we have to be very careful with, spikes. Spike is another term that we borrow from our extreme programming brethren. These are essentially research. Spikes are research tasks, research stories. So I'm going to introduce another story that we saw earlier as my epic. As a theater patron, I can pay for my seat in euros so that I can complete my reservation. So the scenario I'm building in this one for our talk today is that I have a team that's never done anything with a foreign currency. So they really are unsure about how to approach this one and how to get conversion rates and what other unknowns are out there when they start to get into the realm of handling foreign currencies. So if a team felt like they truly did not have enough information to proceed with this story, we could break this story down along research and development lines. As a developer, I must research foreign currency conversions so that I can process euros. Followed and supported by, as a developer, I will implement foreign currency processing so that theater patrons can use their native currency. Now, again, I want to be very careful with this one because personally, I'm not a big fan of developer or team-oriented stories. My view is that your product owners and specifically their stakeholders are hiring you because you're professional. You know how to do these things. So when we start seeing stories that are very developer-focused, sometimes they get abused, and we start seeing stories like, well, as a technical architect, I can put a message broker system in place so that we can pass messages. That's not all that meaningful to those stakeholders. It's all kind of techno gobbledygook to them. I'm nervous about this one a little bit, but I will acknowledge that there are instances where breaking down an epic story into some research stories and some implementation stories may be the best way to break it down. So those are the 8. Here they all are again. There is no particular order to these guys. I'm not saying that number 1 is better and number 8 is worse. There are some down through this list that I think you will use more often than not. I'll shout back out to the workflow steps. I think that's the easiest one. The simple, complex, and major effort ones are easier ones. The ones that may not leap to your mind, like business rules, variations in data, deferring your non-functionals, you should put those on a list someplace and keep them handy to you. The operations ones are also fairly easy. So there's our list of guidelines on how to break epics down into smaller stories. So here's kind of what we started with to kind of wrap it up. We wanted to talk about why epics were still important to us. We wanted to talk about when we broke them down and who is responsible for breaking them down, and then we want to spend time talking about how to do it. So in summary, it looks like this. Epics are still important because epics help us forecast, help us create those artifacts that answer those important questions. But even more so than that, allowing us to defer those details and that work until we need to allows us to get started sooner with our teams. With respect to when can I do them, you can put sessions aside between your sprints or your iterations and have product backlog grooming sessions to break them down. That'll work perfectly fine, but my preferred approach is to break them down as we go, to beg, borrow, entice, bribe product owners some time from those teams, get them some good lunch, and hand them a couple of stories and just sort of clean up as we go and let them stay in the cadence that they're struggling to build. With respect to who does these things, everyone that's involved has some responsibility and something to add to the effort. But at the end of the day, it's the product owner that's carrying the accountability to get it done. And then finally, how do we do it? We looked at 8 guidelines with some fairly clumsy, if you will, examples of different dimensions and different ideas on how to break an epic story down into its smaller constituents. I always like to end up on this one. It's my favorite quote from Dwight D. Eisenhower: "Plans are nothing, planning is everything." And with that, I've got 12:45, and I'm all done. Back to you, Hemant.
Excellent job, Gary. This is very good. So as usual, audience, this is the time now for you guys to reflect on the material that Gary covered, and we already have a few questions in here. But if you have more questions, please add them to the list, and in a few minutes, I'll start picking up the questions and pose them to Gary. In the meantime, while you're doing that, I'll go through a quick introduction to Synerzip to make sure we can cover a little bit of Synerzip background also here for those who are not familiar with Synerzip. So while you're putting your questions, here's a little 2-pager on Synerzip in a nutshell. We are a software product development partner for small to mid-sized technology companies. We do development work as an extension of the in-house team. Almost all the work we do is intellectual property of our clients, and almost all our clients are product development companies. For every client, we put together a high caliber team of dedicated professionals. So dedicated meaning it's a assigned team for that client, which people don't move around from team to team, which is very important when you're doing product development work. And these are highly stable and low turnover kind of teams for our clients, which is very valuable for them. Third point about Synerzip value proposition to our clients is the risk reduction. Given our experience with agile development and our ability to strike the balance between the rigor of software engineering discipline while keeping the responsiveness and the agility along the way, and making that balance strike well for each client helps us reduce the risk for each client. The fourth point is cost reduction argument. We have a dual shore team, a high caliber team of developers and testers and architects in India, and product managers. Some of the product managers we have are based in US, and that dual shore team, with that combination of US and India, we're able to provide pretty consistently a 50% cost advantage to our clients in delivering software. And the last point is the flexibility that we offer to our clients. They are any of our clients who care have the option to convert the team, Synerzip team that works for them, into a captive version of their India team whenever they feel like it. So overall, that's our value proposition to our clients. This next page, as it refreshes on your screen, just gives you a glimpse of some of our clients. Almost all are small to mid-sized product development software companies. With that short introduction to Synerzip, let's come to taking questions. Gary, so are you ready, Gary?
I am ready.
All right, let's take a first.
Ready to go.
Okay, the tricky question, I'm going to read the question off. This is a tough one. That if an epic story leads to heavy refactoring, that is, you've got a lot of architectural cleanup work involved along with the feature development, and it is so complex, all this work that really doesn't fit in a sprint, and at least the team feels very difficult to break it down into a smaller piece because of not all parts will be functional by the end of the sprint. So how do we tackle this challenge in breaking down this kind of a large what appears to be a monolithic epic?
That is a good one. So well, first off, my first blush on that is that if a team finds themselves in that position, then they have waited too long to deal with their technical debt. So this is an indication that that technical debt has piled up, and now they find themselves in a position that they can't work their way out of it without ceasing to deliver value to their customer, or perhaps even delivering a negative value for a little while. So the big picture of that is, don't do that. Don't allow yourself to get into that position. Now, let's assume that you have. So, you know, the rules of Scrum, the rules of any methodology are important. But one of the things I like to remind the practitioners are that's just an implementation of agile values and principles. And once you have satisfied yourself that you understand the rules and those values and principles, then should you need to bend or break a rule, then you can do so, and you should do so, but know why you're breaking it and know what you're breaking so that you can prepare your stakeholders for what's going on. In this particular case, in the hypothetical situation you just described, that team may absolutely have to do 1 or 2 sprints of nothing but refactoring just to get things back into alignment, just to kind of catch up and pay down that debt. And that hopefully is a very rare occasion, and it should be painful, and it should be a lesson that we learn, that part of the challenge and part of the fun, frankly, of doing these things agilely is to continue to deliver value to our customers, making trade-offs, but very nimbly navigating that to minimize the collateral damage of when we have to go back and refactor something or re-implement something with better ideas and technology. So the pithy answer is, if you find yourself in a position where you've got a massive refactoring story that's ahead of you, or a story is going to force your hand and cause you to do the refactoring, then A, bite the bullet, do what you have to do that refactoring, but your retrospective should be full of how in the world can we avoid this painful process again.
Right. That's a good answer. Good. Let's take another question which is somewhat related. From your experience, are there situations, real situations in real world with development teams where it is not feasible or perhaps not advisable to break certain epics or agonize about breaking them because of the nature of the work that they entail?
I'm thinking. I do often run into, especially teams that are just getting their feet under them, a lot of trepidation or worry that should they break a story down, it becomes very invaluable. It becomes less valuable, maybe to the point of not being any value at all. So I do run into that. I don't know if that's exactly the nature of the question, but let me answer that situation. I'm aware of a team, for example, that had broken down a story, maybe inadvisably, but they broke it down into sort of the UI components and then the back-end components. And their idea was, well, I can at least get the face of the thing going, and I can use that to get some sort of idea, am I on the right track from a presentation standpoint, but it won't actually work. It won't be tied to anything. It's just a big mock-up. Part of me would not like that situation because it's not delivering value to the customer. But if indeed we're talking about a 2-week sprint, for example, and these guys were, I think, it's really more of a, okay, I can get a really high quality user interface going in 2 weeks. I can get a 4-week sprint going to get some of my background things going that need to be there because it takes a little longer, and we can meet in the middle sort of thing. And so in that case, I'm like, well, that's certainly not ideal, but if you want to break the story down in that way, and you understand that at least one of your teams is not going to be delivering potentially shippable product, and everyone's on board with that, then so be it. That's usually the kind of answers I'm seeing, Hammett, for those organizations that think, well, this epic is just indivisible. The hesitation that they have is not so much in that they don't have an idea of how to break it down, but they feel like, well, if I break it down that way, I'm violating some of these rules that I need to follow, like potentially shippable, and don't break it along the lines of technology and things like that. If you allow especially experienced teams to relax a little bit and say, maybe you have uncovered that one epic story that really is indivisible unless you do it these ways that are not recommended. Give them permission to break those rules and get past that one. I honestly, though, I cannot remember a time in any of my teams that I've worked with where someone did not discern a way to break a story down. There's one other thing that comes to mind. Many organizations get into that cadence that I talked about, and it becomes very comfortable for them. And teams sometimes forget. The team gets to choose, if you're using Scrum, the team gets to choose the sprint length. So just because you're typically doing 2-week sprints, remember you've got this other dial. If you've got a story and there's no way to break that story down into 2-week chunks, but you can get it done in a month, then do a 1-month sprint. Don't sweat it. Many times, a lot of the ones that we're trying to break down, that'll satisfy them. Now, to your point, there may still be a story out there that for whatever reason, it needs 8 weeks to get done, and there's just no way to break it down in a traditional fashion, in a following the rules fashion. They may exist. I just haven't run into them.
Okay, excellent. All right, let's take another question, Gary, which is, would you clarify or amplify, maybe a better word, what you covered on the process and the roles for breaking epics down? So, for example, does this happen during the iteration planning kind of a format where the team is sitting around, and what is the contribution of a QA person or a business analyst or a Scrum Master in this whole exercise, or so the role and the process around breaking stories down?
Yeah, that's a good one. So, yeah, I went pretty high level over the accountable and responsible bits of the breakdown stuff. So let's delve into that a little bit. First and foremost, I am not personally a fan of these breaking down and these sizing sessions occurring during sprint planning meetings, the ones that the process calls out for. I personally consider the product backlog grooming sessions to be part of what the product owner and their support staff have to do, and those are going on concurrently with my sprint work. So number one, it's not the same meetings. If teams are showing up and product owners are showing up at sprint planning day with epic stories that have never been sized before, this whole process starts to really kind of get gummed up and fall apart. So those are concurrent or parallel activities. So whether you choose to do that activity between sprints, or as I like to say, as I recommend, as you go, the team is brought to bear in those sprint planning sessions to help the product owner wisely break the stories down, but most importantly to size them. So one of the things that let's take a specific role like the business analyst. Those folks that have business analyst expertise are adept at being able to describe or discern conditions of satisfaction. So I see product backlog or product owners being supported by business analysts and subject matter experts to really help them enumerate conditions of satisfaction, acceptance criteria. So when we're breaking that big story down into small one, well, those small stories need acceptance criteria as well. So we want those folks to take those abstraction muscles that they're so good at, the mental model that they have, and apply it towards writing acceptance criteria for those smaller stories. The QA folks, they are also tremendously valuable in this, in the same area of acceptance tests, because while the BAs, in my experience, are kind of focused on how do I maximize the value and what are the success criteria, our QA folks are thinking, how do I test this to make sure it's going to survive? How do I break it? How do I flex it? How do I make sure I cover those edge cases? And we want that type of testing to be often to be represented even at the acceptance criteria level. It gets even more important when you're working with products that may have some safety concerns about them, where if you do something wrong, someone can actually be harmed. So your QA folks, part of their opportunity in these breakdown sessions is to help make sure that as we break the stories down finer, they're still able to get in those acceptance criteria that cover the non-happy path of things. Now they have one other piece too. The QA folks, if they and their team have embraced the concept of test-focused or test-driven type of development, then it's often the case that the QA folks have already invested in some test planning. They may already have some test cases and test scripts already created. As we break epic stories down into smallers, they're going to have some maintenance on those artifacts. So they may have to go in and refactor some of those test scripts, augment or change those test plans. In addition, those smaller stories now give them opportunity to further populate those testing artifacts and controls that the test teams are putting into place. So their responsibility is to be full-blown members of the team, helping make sure that we stay focused on quality, and if we're test-driven, we stay test-driven while we're breaking the epics down into the smaller stories. Scrum Master and product owners, I think that's fairly straightforward. As a Scrum Master, I often say, I'm less interested in what you're building, but I'm keenly interested in how you're building it. So during these sessions, your Scrum Master often is the facilitator and the timekeeper. I spend an awful lot of time filling up people's coffee cups and making sure lunch is getting there and doing just those fit and feature sort of things that help the team stay focused on the task at hand. I'm often there to arbitrate when maybe tempers get to flaring or we get stuck on something. But probably the most important reason that you want your Scrum Master there when we're trying to do this hard task of breaking epics down into small is when teams get paralyzed by the rules. Your Scrum Master is the one that should be representing the rules of the game to the team, to the product owner, to the business. They are also the ones that should be able to give you forgiveness or permission, whichever you need, should you need to break a rule because of the situation.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Gary, for covering this session. There are a number of good questions that we could take on, but I think in the interest of time and to respect what we committed for an hour of this webinar, we need to wrap it up. Thank you all for attending today's webinar, and Gary, thank you for covering the content. Stay tuned, folks, for next webinar next month or towards the end of this month, perhaps, depending on how the schedules work out. Right? Thanks all.
Thank you all. Goodbye.
Bye.